In this video, I'll be covering JavaScript variables, and I'll also be touching on the if statement. Then I'll show you how to use JavaScript variables along with jQuery to cycle through multiple images when they are clicked. Here's an example. I'll click on this image of an 8-ball, and you'll see it fade out and a new image will fade in. And if I click on it again, this image will fade out and another one will appear. And then if I click on it one more time, the original image of the 8-ball comes back. So let's start by looking at the HTML document that we'll be using. We have an H1 heading element, followed by 3 P elements, and then they're followed by an image element. And then up here in the head section, we have a style that sets the background color to yellow for all of the P elements. And here's the JavaScript code that we'll be using. As you can see, we are using a click event along with the H1 heading element. So the code that goes right here will be run whenever the user clicks on an H1 heading. So now let's add a variable. But what are variables? You can think of a variable as a container that holds something. It can hold things like a string of text, or a number, or an array. And there are some other data types that it can hold as well. To create a variable, we use the keyword var. And then we follow that with a variable name. And we're going to name our variable hText. Now, one thing to note about variable names. They can include numbers, but you can't start a variable name with a number. And now to put something into our variable, we use the equal sign. And we are going to put a string of text into our variable, and so we need to enclose the string of text within quotation marks. And then I need to end this statement with a semicolon. Okay, so how do we use our variable now? Well, let's add some code here to see one way to use our variable. We'll start with the selector, so I'll type a $, followed by parentheses. And I'm going to specify the p tags. And then I'll use the text method. And I'll add some text to this. The text method will change the text of all p elements to this text. Since this text is enclosed in quotation marks, it is a text string. The text up here for our variable is also enclosed in quotation marks, and so this is also a text string. Because this variable is holding a text string, we can delete this text string and replace it with our variable. And this is something important to notice. When I use the variable name, I do not enclose it within quotation marks. That's because the word hText is not considered a string. It's a variable name. Our variable may contain a text string, but again, the variable name itself is not considered a text string. So what this line of code does is it changes the text within the P elements to the text that we have defined up here in our variable. So let's try this out. So I'll click on the H1 heading tag. So you can see that the text for all 3 of these paragraph tags changed to the text that we specified in our variable. So over here with our JavaScript code, this is the text that we put into the variable. But instead of typing out this text, we could have used a method that returns text. So let me show you what I mean. Let me type a selector here. And for this selector, I'm going to specify an ID name. And when we specify an ID name, we need to start it with a # or hash mark. And if we go back over to our HTML code, we're going to use the ID that was given to this H1 heading element. And the ID that we used was just head1. So we'll go back here and type that in. And this will allow us to specify this specific H1 heading element. And then we're going to use the method text. Then we follow this with parentheses. But here, I'm not going to include anything in between these parentheses. And if we don't include any text between these parentheses, then instead of setting text, this will read the text. So this statement says that we want to read the text from the h1 heading element. And the value that we read back will be a text string. So it's a text string that we will be putting into our hText variable. And then since we're using this variable down here, this will change the text of our p tag to the text that was contained in our h1 heading element. So let's take a look at this. So I'll click on the h1 heading tag. So the text for all three of these p elements changed to the same text that we were using up in our heading tag. And now I'll show you how we can combine variables together. So I'm going to come over here and just paste in some other variables. So here we're still reading the text from our h1 element, and we're putting that into this variable. And then we created another variable called text1, and we're putting this string inside of that variable. And then we're creating another variable called text2, and what we're putting inside text2 is text1 plus hText. And when we add a plus sign, what that does is combine these two variables together. So text1 you can see equals this string of text right here, and hText holds what we're reading from the heading element. So what we are putting into text2 is this string of text followed by the string of text held in our h1 heading tag. So then what we want to do is to take the contents of this text2 variable and we want to put it right here. So I just type in text2. So now all of this new text will replace the text in the p tags. So let's try this out. So I click on the h1 heading element, and we can see that the text was replaced in the p tags. And this text right here, remember this is the text that was in our text1 variable, and then this was combined with our hText variable, which is the text from the h1 heading tag. Now if we come back over here, I'll show you that there was an easier way that we could have done this. So I'm going to copy this text right here, and I'm going to paste it right here. And then after this text that I just pasted, I'm going to add a plus sign. And now I can get rid of these lines of code. So now all in one statement, I've combined this text string with the text that's returned from our heading tag. And I've combined them together using the plus sign. So then now I can come down here and change this back to hText. And so let's try this out in the browser. And now this should work the same way as the previous example worked. So I'll click on the h1 heading tag, and we can see that we combined our text string with the text string that came from our heading tag. Now let's come back over here and delete this line. And let's create another variable, so I'll type var, and this time let's call it line num. And this is just short for line number. And then we add our equal sign so we can put something into this variable. But this time what we're going to put into the variable is a number. And I'm just going to use the number 0. And then we end the statement with a semicolon. Now since we're using a number here and not a string, we do not enclose the number within quotation marks. And now down here with this statement, I'm going to remove this statement and I'm going to paste in a new statement. For this statement, I'm still using the selector for the p tags, but I'm going to use the method EQ. And the EQ method lets me select just one of these p elements, and it lets me select it by using an index number. And if I use the index number 0, that will select the very first p tag. And if I were to use the number 1, that would select the second p tag. And if I use the number 2, that would select the third p tag. But here you can see in the parentheses, instead of entering a number directly, I'm entering the name of this variable. And since this is a variable name, I do not enclose it within quotation marks. And up here, since I set this line number variable to 0, that's the same as if I were to have typed a 0 between these parentheses. And then I've added a CSS method so that I can change the background color to red. So let's try this out. I'll click on the H1 heading tag, and you can see that it changed the background color of the first P element since its index number is 0. So let's go back over here and create another variable. So I'll type var, and then I'll give it a variable name of a number. And I'll set the value of this variable to 5. And now I'll add another line of code to show you how you can use math with these numbers. So here I'll use the line number variable, and I'll say that that equals our a number variable minus 4. So there's a couple of things to notice here. Since I've already used the var statement right here to create the line number variable, I don't need to use the var statement again when I use the line number variable right here. And the second thing to notice is even though I've given it a value here of 0, I can always change the value later on. And that's what I've done right here. So you can see that the variable a number is equal to 5, and I subtracted 4 from it, so the new value that's put into this line number variable is the value of 1. And since this line number variable is used right here, the new value of 1 will be used for this EQ method, and so now I will be selecting the P element that has an index value of 1. So let's try this out. So I'll click on the H1 heading tag. We can see that the background color has changed for the second P tag because the second P tag is the one that has the index value of 1. So now I'll show you how you can increment a variable that contains a number. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these 2 lines of text, and then I'm going to paste in another line of text right here. And the line of text that I just pasted in simply changes the background color of all of the P elements to yellow. Then after that, we change the background color to red for the P element that is pointed to by this index number. And since we set this index number to a value of 0 right here, this will change the background color of the very first P tag. But now let's add another line of code also. And here I'm going to type the name of our variable, which is line num, and then after it I'm going to add 2 plus signs. And then this is the end of the statement, so I need to add a semicolon. And what these 2 plus signs do is to increment this line number variable by 1. So up here we set the line number to a value of 0, and then that number of 0 was used for this index number. And so after we set the background color to red, then we're going to increment this index number by 1. And the second time that the H1 element is clicked, our line number will now be 1, and so when we come down here to this EQ method, we'll be using an index value of 1. And then we increment it again, and then it'll be 2, and so then the next time we enter this click event again, we'll enter it with the value of 2. And by the way, if you use 2 minus signs instead of 2 plus signs, then it will decrement this variable instead of increment it. But let's take a look at this. So I'll click on the heading tag. We can see that the background color changed for our first paragraph tag, and that's because it has an index value of 0, and that was the value of our variable. But our variable value should have also been incremented now, and so now when we click the heading tag again, the background color of the second line has changed. And that's because as soon as we click this heading tag, our variable already had a value of 1. And so now if I click the heading tag again, the background color of the third P element changes. And this third P element has an index value of 2. But now if I click it again, none of the P tags have their background color changed. And that's because when I clicked it, our variable now equaled 3, and we don't have any P tags with an index value of 3. So how can we prevent the number in our variable from getting too big? We can use something called an if statement, and I'll show you how that works. So let's come over here and add a new line after we increment our line number variable. And the if statement begins with the word if, and then we'll follow this by a pair of parentheses, and then we'll follow this by a pair of curly brackets. Now inside the parentheses here, we are going to perform a test. And the test that we are going to perform is to compare our line num variable with a number. So I type in our variable name, and then I'm going to use a less than sign, and then I'll type the number 2. So this means line number less than 2. And when you do these tests, you can also use other symbols. You can do this, which means line number is greater than 2, or you can add 2 equal signs, and this means line number is equal to 2. And a common error that people make is that they'll use 1 equal sign. And you don't want to do that because that will take the number 2 and it will assign it to this variable. And we don't want to do that. We just want to test to see if it's equal to that variable. And so that's why you use 2 equal signs. And you can also use a less than sign followed by an equal sign. And that means line number is less than or equal to 2. Or you can use a greater than sign, and that means line number greater than or equal to 2. And you can also use an exclamation mark followed by an equal sign, which means not equal to 2. But we want to use the greater than sign. So the test that we're performing is we're checking to see if line number is greater than 2. So the way that you can read this is to say if line number is greater than 2, then we want to do something. And the thing that we do is placed inside of these curly brackets. So now let's add a statement inside these curly brackets. So I'll type in our variable name, and I'll say that it's equal to 0. And since this is a statement right here, I need to end it with a semicolon. So now what this full line says is that if line number is greater than 2, then we want the line number to now be equal to 0. So when we click on the H1 element and we change the background colors and then we increment our variable here, then this if statement gives us a way to check to make sure that our variable is not too big. If it is too big, in other words, if it's greater than 2, then we want to reset our variable back to the value of 0. So now let's try this out. So I click on the heading tag, and it changes the background color of the first P tag. I'll click the heading tag again, and now we've changed the background color of the second P tag. I click it again, we change the background of the third, and now when I click it again, now we've changed the background of the first one again. So if I just keep clicking on the heading tag, this will just cycle through all of the P tags. And now let's go back over to our JavaScript code and make some changes. I'm going to start by changing the name of our variable. And let's call this image name. And instead of putting a number into this variable, I'm going to put an array into it. And I'm just going to paste the value for this. And what an array is a group of multiple values. To use an array, you specify multiple values within square brackets. And so inside of these square brackets, I have 3 string values. And each of the string values is enclosed in quotation marks. And these string values are separated by commas. And now this image name variable now contains all 3 of these string values. And now I'm going to declare another variable, and I'll name this one index num. And I'll set this to a value of 0. And I want to remove all of these lines of code, and I want to replace it with some new code, and so I'm just going to paste in the new code. And now let's look at what this code will do. I'm first using a selector where I've specified an ID value of picture. And let's go take a quick look at our HTML code. And we can see that for our image tag, I've used an ID value of picture. So by using this selector right here, I'm specifying that particular image tag. And here I'm using the attr method, which changes an attribute of that tag. So the attribute that I'm changing is the source attribute. And then this says that I want to change the source attribute to floatingball.gif. So that will change the image from the 8-ball to a floating ball when the user clicks on the H1 element. But instead of changing this when the user clicks on the H1 element, I would rather have this image change when the user clicks on the image itself. And so I'll set this selector to also refer to the image tag. So now when the user clicks on the image tag, then the image will change to floatingball.gif. But now what I want to do, instead of changing it to just this value that we have right here, I want to use the array that we defined. So I'll get rid of this, and I'll paste in this. And what we have here is the name of our array variable, which is image name, that we defined up here. And the way that we get a value out of the array is we use square brackets, and then inside the square brackets, we specify an index number. So if we use an index number of 0, we'll get the first element in the array, which is floatingball.gif. And if we use an index number of 1, we'll get the second element, which is redball.gif. And then if we use an index number of 2, we'll get the third value that's within our array. And we could use an actual number inside these square brackets. So I could have just put a 0, a 1, or a 2 here. But instead, I used a variable name. And this particular variable, we've already set its value to 0 right here. So the first time that we click on this image, this index number will be equal to 0. So this 0 will reference the very first image that we have in our array, which is floatingball.gif. And then after the image is changed, then we will increment our index number. And now its value will be 1. And just like before, we're also going to test our index number to make sure that it's not greater than 2. And if it is greater than 2, then we're going to set it back to 0 again. So this code that we have here will let us cycle through 3 different images. So let's go ahead and look at this. So I'll click on the image, and it changes to the floating ball. And then if I click on it a second time, it changes to the image of the red ball. And then I click on it again, and we go back to our original image of the 8-ball. And then every time I click on this, it will cycle to the next picture. And so now let's change our code so that it will not only cycle through the pictures, but each time that we click on it, we want it to fade out, and then we want the new picture to fade in. So I'm going to start by pasting in some code to get us started. So now what this code will do is that whenever the user clicks on our image, then the image will fade out over a period of 300 milliseconds or 0.3 seconds. But we can add a callback function to this fade out method. And the callback function will be run as soon as the fade out completes. So to add our callback function, we follow the 300 by a comma, and then type the word function, and follow that by a pair of parentheses, and then follow that by a pair of curly brackets. And then I'll put my cursor between the curly brackets and hit enter a couple times to give myself some space to work. And now the code that I put right here will be run as soon as the fade out method finishes. So I'm just going to paste some code in here. And this code will change the source attribute of our image. And just like before, we're going to use our variable that holds the array. And now I'm going to paste in 2 more lines of code. And this line increments our index num variable. And we use this variable as an index for our array. And then with this line of code, we're checking to make sure that the index num variable never gets too big. And if it does, then we reset it to 0 with this. And now that we've changed our image with this line of code, and we've updated our index num variable, now we need to bring the image back into view. So I'm going to paste in another line of code. And for this line of code, we're using a selector for the image again, and then we're using the fade in method to fade our image back in over a period of a half second. So to summarize, we're going to fade out our image, and then we're going to switch images, and then we're going to update our variable index num, and then we're going to make sure that it's not too big, and then we're going to fade in a new image. So let's take a look at this in our browser. So I'll click on our image, and we see that it faded out and the new image faded in. And then we click again, and the same thing happens with another image. And then we click again, and now we're back to our original image. And of course, if we keep clicking, it'll just cycle through these images. Well, that concludes this video. You can find the sample code used in this video at littlewebhut.com. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and leave a comment.